Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we'll get started. We do only have an hour. Hlimoo, Doik, Sitnism, Webeksum, Satuan. Good morning. Well, big welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar called Transformative Actions for UNDRIP Advancement, the next $100 million. My name is Tara Marsden. My Gitxsan name is Naxginkw, and I am the UNDRIP Fellow for the Real Estate Foundation in partnership with my consultancy, Hlimoo Sustainable Solutions. I am joining you today from the Gitxsan unceded territories of Wilkes-Barre, which is in New Hazelton, BC. And I'm joined today by Mark Gifford, who will introduce himself shortly, and he's the CEO of the Real Estate Foundation. We're going to share with you today a draft report that we are doing engagement on, and we will have some polling questions and a chance for discussion and questions through the function on the webinar at the end. So just to provide a bit of an overview of what we'd like to cover today, we've shared our welcoming, and we'll ask for an introduction from everybody in the chat momentarily. I'll then turn it over to Mark Gifford for his opening comments and a few of the background slides on the Real Estate Foundation. I'll go into the transformative actions, and then we'll have some time for questions, discussion, and feedback, and then potentially some more closing comments from Mark if we have time, depending on the discussion portion. So if you don't mind, just in the chat function, please share with us your name, your Indigenous name if you have one, your organization or your affiliation generally, and the territory you're joining us from. And then, yeah, people can see the folks that we're sharing time and space with today. And as you're getting started doing that, I will turn it over to Mark to share a little bit about the background on the Real Estate Foundation.
Well, good morning. Thanks, Tara. And really appreciate folks joining us this morning. I'll try not to get too distracted by the folks introducing themselves alongside. As Tara said, my name is Mark Gifford, and my day job is as CEO of the Real Estate Foundation of BC. And I'm calling in this morning from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, where our offices are located. But as many of you are likely aware, we work in territories across the province. So glad to have you here today. We thought we'd just start with a little bit of background, even if many are familiar to some degree or not. I think as probably many of us if not most of us are on this call today are likely to some degree, the Real Estate Foundation of BC is on its journey of truth and reconciliation and trying to take meaningful steps to listen, learn, and act in ways that strengthen respectful and reciprocal relationships with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in our work across what's known as BC. It's far from perfect, but looking forward to being able to share some of our thinking and of where we're at and where we hope to go through the implementation of our draft plan as Transformative Actions for UNDRIP Advancement, or TAUA for short. In this work, it's been important in these early days for us to prioritize the perspectives and experiences of BC First Nations, Indigenous-led organizations, and partners. And we've been receiving some feedback and hosting conversations. We're indebted to the work of Tara. You'll hear a lot more from her today, who's been an independent partner, coach, advocate, thought leader in her role as UNDRIP Fellow. So for REFBC, our mission is to fund projects, build relationships, and share knowledge to advance sustainable, equitable, and socially just land use and real estate practices across BC, got this big vision of a healthy environment that supports thriving, resilient, livable communities from one generation to the next. And we're a creature of statute. So we're, we're a creature of a colonial statute, sort of a creative way in the 1980s to find a way to create some public and community benefit from real estate transactions. And so it's been established. It was established in 1985, and since that time has granted out about $100 million to community projects advancing land use and real estate practices in BC. So it's also a good pivot point for us to be looking forward at what our future looks like and what the invitation to think about what that next 100 million looks like. Next slide, Tara. So, I mentioned, as a creature of statute, a little bit more on what that means in terms of our money story, and that's that we're a benefit from real estate transactions when a deposit's made on the purchase of a property in BC, and it's placed in a real estate brokerage trust account at a bank or a credit union. It earns a little bit of interest. That money's pooled, and financial institutions are required to remit that to REFBC. We pool it again, invest it, and use that to both generate a little additional revenue and move that out into community in the form of grants. And so that's sort of our kind of technical money story, but it's rooted in the land, and it's rooted in it's a money story that's rooted in displacement and theft of First Nations lands, and is also an opportunity for us to think about as a colonial construct and as an organization trying to do justice to through our work to relationships with First Nations and folks and territories from which we've benefited. What does that invite us to think about in terms of doing differently and moving forward through our work? Next slide, Tara. Their funding priorities frame our work. We've got 5 broad interest areas that we fund through: land use, freshwater, built environments, food sovereignty, and real estate profession. And this big goal of more and more REFBC's funded projects uphold or advance the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We've also, over the last couple of years, developed in partnership with Indigenous leadership, an Indigenous grant stream, and which relies on their leadership and direction to move forward. Tara? Just a note on our board of directors, we have a 7-member board of directors and board of governors. I'm not sure, I think I saw Leslie joining, Leslie Dickey, but I'm not sure if there's other governors on the call today, but big hello. They're all appointed by external appointing bodies, which include the province of BC and the Union of BC Municipalities, the Real Estate Institute of BC, the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and the BC Real Estate Association. So really kind of interesting governance model as well, where we have people and organizations with connections to land use and real estate decision making in the province, supporting our governance. You'll hear a little bit more from Tara as we move along. What that invites us to think about, or from a governance standpoint, through the plans that we have. I think I'll comment at the end, I think, but this journey we're on and we've been on has both, and a whole of organization approach has both, it asks different things of all of us, and it can feel uncomfortable and uncertain at times, but our early steps in this work have been incredibly rewarding. And for those of you who are on the call feeling like, we're in this work, like where do we fit in this work, and or feeling uncertain in moving forward in it, that's normal. But it's also important, and it's important for building trust, for building credibility, for actually putting into practice commitments to reconciliation and justice, and ensuring that communities and nations from whom so much has been taken are able to direct and lead on ways that in terms of ways they may also benefit. So and that's a benefit for and a gift for us. So I'll look forward to listening to Tara and having you here, and seeing you soon, or seeing you in the corner of my screen.
Thanks, Mark. So I think Stephen's got a poll that he's going to put up shortly, but we really wanted to kind of see, I guess the level of knowledge of UNDRIP amongst our participants today. And there we go. Thank you. So please feel free to engage through the poll. And I love the live data. It's amazing. And so, as we go through this work, it's a learning experience, as Mark has mentioned, around UNDRIP and what it means, and that UNDRIP isn't only the job of the federal and provincial governments. It's not only the job of Indigenous peoples, but really the job of everybody who has a role around land, especially. And so the UN Declaration, as you can see there, is something that has been around for a while, and it's just getting more traction because of provincial and federal adoption more recently. But it is an international instrument. It has legal weight to it, but we don't have a legal enforcement system for UNDRIP. We do not have an international court that can hold Justin Trudeau accountable when he fails to live up to the principles of UNDRIP. But it was adopted by the whole UN General Assembly minus 4 countries back in 2007, Canada being one of those initial objectors to UNDRIP. And it's really important to know that UNDRIP does not grant rights. It is a recognition of inherent existing rights, and that the UN is not somehow granting rights that supersede state rights or infringe upon state sovereignty, as people have raised alarms about. But these rights are really just the minimum standards for survival and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And so many Indigenous people want to go above and beyond UNDRIP and have it more as the floor and not the ceiling. So there's 46 articles overall. They're organized into those broad categories. And so a lot of the focus of the Real Estate Foundation is around the articles regarding lands, territories, and resources, as well as a little into political economic rights and self-government. And so, as I mentioned, Canada did oppose UNDRIP until 2016. And it was then that they removed their objector status and they became a full endorser. They had to then legislate UNDRIP, and that is one of the calls to action under UNDRIP, is that states domesticate it. And so in 2019, the province of BC was the first Canadian government to do so with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or what we call DRIPA. And in 2021, the federal government followed that similar model and enacted their own legislation. It's really important to know those are only the colonial government's interpretation of UNDRIP, and they do not override or supersede what is actually in the UNDRIP articles. And so I think there's some concern amongst Indigenous peoples, especially, that somehow UNDRIP has been morphed into DRIPA. But UNDRIP stands, it has been adopted globally, and each individual Indigenous nation can and should and will determine what UNDRIP means for themselves. So that's an important component of interpretation, is Indigenous peoples, of course. So the journey, the winding journey, sometimes, as Mark mentioned, a little uncomfortable, sometimes difficult. We don't want to paint this as a perfect rosy picture, but I would say a concerted and committed effort on behalf of the Real Estate Foundation to live up to help advance UNDRIP and the articles therein. So this started for me back in 2020. I was invited to join what was called Healthy Watersheds Initiative as a senior Indigenous advisor. And there was 3 objectives for Healthy Watersheds Initiative. And I see there's some grantees on the participant list, so welcome. And hopefully this will, you'll be able to see your contributions and how they have informed this work. So this was a economic stimulus package from the provincial government. They asked REFBC to administer the funds, and there was 3 objectives, and 2 were fairly easy to measure progress on, and that was job creation and then watershed health monitoring, restoration, planning. So a lot of technical reporting and data. But the 3rd was UNDRIP Advancement. And so it was difficult to say, how would we measure our progress? How would we know if we are actually advancing UNDRIP or not? And so we developed, under the guidance of the Indigenous Leaders Advisory Circle, an 8-member committee from across BC, from Indigenous leaders in watershed work. We developed an evaluation framework, and we developed a series of questions that could be answered by grantees once they were done their work and doing their reporting. And we learned quite a bit. One of the data points that we got out of that was that if you want to advance UNDRIP, you're going to have a higher success rate if you support Indigenous-led projects. And so this is an obvious one for Indigenous people, but it was good to get that data. And it was through a series of questions, and the overwhelming sort of majority of Indigenous-led projects achieved all of the UNDRIP outcomes, whereas the non-Indigenous ones struggled because they potentially didn't have the partnerships in place and were not Indigenous-led. So learning from that, REFBC wanted to make this learning more permanent and to make their commitments around UNDRIP more permanent. So they invited me to join in partnership and establish the UNDRIP Fellowship. So we did that in 2022. And then we really started working. We started doing the learnings with staff, with board, and what is UNDRIP? How can it be applied? What are the articles? What is the current state of play for First Nations in BC and beyond? Developing the concept framing, and then bringing the board in at key points and giving us direction and support and guidance. And we finalized the TAUA, which is the draft report that we're all discussing today, and that was approved for engagement back in July. And it really is only approved to go out to be engaged upon. And so it is not the final report. And we've done a series of First Nations engagement as rights and title holders to lands in BC. And that will inform the changes going forward, as well as any feedback we get from yourselves today. So this is what the report looks like. We did, as I mentioned, launch a 4-month review period for First Nations, wanting to ensure there was adequate time, but not so much time that it becomes kind of stale if you leave it too open-ended. And really learning from my experience working for multiple First Nations on engagement and consultation processes, that there has to be a multiple options for engagement. We can't just stick to the 30-day respond in writing type approach. So I'm available for one-on-one interviews with leaders and staff. We've had a couple focus groups, and also, online survey, written submissions, and any other options that people wanted to see. And we do offer capacity funds to ensure that people are not being taken away from their other jobs and work without fair compensation for their time. So just to go into the various sections of the TAUA. So the first is the background, and this is really what Mark has kind of covered, what I've shared in terms of what UNDRIP is, what the Real Estate Foundation of BC is, and its purpose and its work. And then the UNDRIP Fellowship and how this connects to the REFBC strategic plan. So really tying the whole of organization approach back to the current strategic plan, which is in place until 2025. And as Mark mentioned, REFBC being a creature of provincial statute, there is a duty and a responsibility there to participate, to contribute to things like redress, to things like free, prior, informed consent. And so while the Real Estate Foundation is not governed by the government of BC, it is the Real Estate Services Act, which actually allows for the revenues to flow and also has the current governance structure and appointing bodies to the board kind of baked into it. And so it's that recognition that is the foundation and the framing for this transformative actions. Also, in terms of background and context, who are the Indigenous people in the REFBC service area? So there are over 204 individual First Nations. There are also other Indigenous people who live in the lands of BC or in the territories that are in so-called BC. Those Indigenous people could be from elsewhere and migrating to urban centers. They could be Métis or Inuit. But when we're talking about land-based work, we need to focus on those rights and title holders as a priority, which are First Nations with territories in this province. There's also a lot of diversity, and this is why we need something that is fairly high level and simply empowers nations to direct how UNDRIP can be implemented through projects, through granting and governance. And there's so much diversity amongst our Indigenous peoples in BC. We have the Indian Act band councils as some representative bodies. We also have traditional forms of government. So in my territory, the Gitxsan, the Wet'suwet'en, the Gitniao still have hereditary leaders. We still have traditional forms of government over our territories. And we also have some modern day treaty self-governments in BC. So there's a strong diversity, and this really needs to be reflected and upheld and taught through the various training and workshops that the staff and Board of Governors participate in. And so this is also reflected in the engagement and outreach approach. We didn't want to just go to provincial level organizations and engage. We wanted to really ensure that every nation had a chance to read this, had a chance to respond. So the purpose, what is this intended to do? So it's really intended to articulate the commitment to UNDRIP by the Real Estate Foundation. It's intended to be a fairly short and concise document and transparent for progress, to measure progress and having actions that can then be measured in terms of their completion or their progress on them. But it's also intended to be a roadmap for potential grantees. And so many of you may be past grantees of the Real Estate Foundation and wondering what's going to change, or some of you might be potential applicants as different granting programs are implemented. And so it's intended to help provide that roadmap to understand, well, what do we mean when we say we are supporting and advancing UNDRIP? And so hopefully it provides that, and definitely open to feedback from the grantee perspective on it. So there are the approach and methods. Again, for transparency, how did we approach this? What were the methods and who was involved? What are the relevant UNDRIP articles that we've applied? And then what are the actions themselves? So for many people unfamiliar with UNDRIP or somewhat familiar, a great way to familiarize yourself is to just simply read the articles. There's a lot of material, a lot of literature, a lot of discussion around the whole of UNDRIP. But if you just read the articles, they're so simply written, they're so to the point and concise. And so I really welcome people to just dive in and to try and learn through reading the actual articles themselves. And so these are the ones that through my work I've identified as being most relevant to the Real Estate Foundation. And so this is a similar format that we did with Healthy Watersheds Initiative, and that I'm also doing with different folks in universities in applying UNDRIP to research, as well as with local government in applying UNDRIP to the work of local government. So it's sort of a framework that I've kind of developed over the last couple of years. And so I won't go through all of them, but you can start to see key ones like Article 18, the right to participate in decision-making when things are affecting our rights. And so, you know, with the Real Estate Foundation and the grants that are distributed, those are all decisions that are being made that affect lands and waters and rights. And so there's a right to participate either as board members or as leaders on the Indigenous Leaders Circle, advising on the Indigenous grant stream, as well as on the projects themselves. And so sometimes we would see more in the past, but projects that had been completely designed, a land-based project, maybe by an NGO, completely designed without Indigenous involvement and direction setting. And so decision-making really means that. It means being involved in those key decisions. Article 25 is the distinctive spiritual relationship to land of Indigenous people. And so if you look at many proposals, funding calls, or the reporting requirements for various funding sources, there's a lot of focus around those technical outputs. You know, what's the data? What are the number of, willows that have been planted in the riparian? All of those really quantitative outputs. And what we saw with healthy watersheds and the learning from that growing into current funding priorities as well is that there's a lack of understanding that, lands will be healthier, waters will be healthier when there's people who have a spiritual connection to those lands and waters and who care for them, as we have for thousands of generations. And so recognizing that, ensuring that that is accounted for in budgeting and work planning, and that there's some flexibility on reporting outcomes when you have more of a spiritual approach to land as opposed to a land use or a land management approach. Article 26 builds on that. It's the right to land itself. And so we have to recognize at the starting place that the Real Estate Foundation generates this revenue, is a beneficiary of revenue from the sale and resale of unceded lands. And so we also know that the office of the Real Estate Foundation is located in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation territories, and that there's an opportunity to support their work around UNDRIP as well. Article 28 is the right to redress, and this can be restitution, this can be compensation for lands and waters taken without consent or damaged without consent. And so, there's no intention here that the Real Estate Foundation should be the only entity responsible for redress, or that is what Indigenous people have even called for. It's simply a recognition that when you have this amount of revenue, there is an opportunity and a responsibility to at least contribute to redress. And so the focus, again, around supporting Indigenous-led work, supported by data that says that Indigenous-led work does in fact help advance UNDRIP, that this is a nice complementary approach with that regard. And then Article 32.2 around free, prior, and informed consent. And so again, the foundation of unceded lands being sold without consent and being essentially unavailable unless the nation purchases themselves as a willing buyer, willing seller. A lot of our land in some territories has been taken up by many non-Indigenous people over the years. And so that as a recognition point for framing this work. So there's currently no policy. One of the actions that I'll talk about is really developing that policy of what free, prior, and informed consent looks like at a project level. And so many times in proposals and applications, you'll see, is there a partnership? And maybe it's a letter of confirmation proving that there's a partnership with Indigenous people and an applicant. But we really want to ensure there's a lot of complexity in BC, that we have overlapping territories. Sometimes we have disputed areas. And so there's a bit of confusion around who might be partnered with. and who has the legitimate representative voice for the nation and the territory. And so this is going to be a much harder task, but there needs to be, I think, a commitment to develop that policy around consent, around partnership for various projects that are granted to. And so that is a longer term objective, definitely. So overall, there are 50 transformative actions in the TAUA. These were developed with input from advisors, Indigenous advisors, with sort of the feedback of long-term grant staff who have worked with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous projects over the years, as well as myself, and just informed by research as well. And so this format that we really borrowed was from the City of Vancouver UNDRIP strategy. And that was developed by the three nations, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And then it was adopted by the City of Vancouver. So it's a very well-developed, well-thought-out strategy, and just so grateful for the work that they did to kind of set a template that others could work from. And so we have 3 categories of actions, and then they're organized into 4 subcategories. And so looking at the function of the Real Estate Foundation, we have grants, governance, and organization operations. And then we have the subcategories, which is really the time or the relative ease of these actions. And so we have early action or in progress, longer term change, deeply transformative, and things that will actually require legislative change, and then will be part of another more likely a DRIPA type engagement. So under grants, we have 19 actions, under governance, 10, and under organization, we have 21. So I'm just going to share with you a few examples, and please feel free to use the appendix in the report to just see them at a glance if you just wanted to look at what they are as a whole. And so under grants, one of the key outcomes that has already been achieved, which Mark mentioned, is the creation of an Indigenous grant stream. And so this was started as a pilot right when we were starting the TAUA process. And this was established as a pilot and started with around 800,000 annually. It's since been approved by the board, and this is a great cause for celebration, to be a permanent funding stream at the Real Estate Foundation. And they have increased their budget to 2 million and will steadily increase based on available funds. And so this is an Indigenous grant stream that the Board of Governors simply sort of devolves their decision-making authority to the Indigenous Leaders Circle. And so I think there's a couple members on as well. I saw Marilyn Baptiste from Hlimoo, she's on, and she's one of the Indigenous Community Leaders Circle advisors. And I believe Taylor might be on as well. So there's, I think they started with 5 and now they're down to 4, but they are making decisions. They are sort of doing the outreach and sharing the opportunity with different Indigenous communities and ensuring that there's support in place for grantees. And I'll share some examples of what those projects look like later. So there's that sort of carved out a steady amount, a stable, consistent amount for Indigenous projects. Under the general grants category, there is a action to support, to increase and maintain a certain percentage of general grants going to Indigenous-led land, water, and food sovereignty projects. So just to understand where we started from, what our baseline was that back in 2021, it was below 5% of general grants were going to Indigenous-led projects. And just with the application of UNDRIP criteria in the different proposal calls, in the review, and in the decision-making processes, by applying UNDRIP criteria, that has increased to over 50% in 2023. So a huge change in a relatively short amount of time, and just really showing what is possible when people don't resist change, when they see something that makes sense and they go with it. And all of those projects, again, are Indigenous-led, land-based work, and they are throughout the provincial area. So to do that, you do need UNDRIP criteria. And so the other action there is to weight UNDRIP criteria with increasing significance in all the review of applications. And so they are also including folks like myself and other Indigenous advisors in the review, and so that they are sort of double checking and confirming when they are reviewing project applications, how to best apply UNDRIP criteria. This is really important when you have more applications than you have money, and so you have to use criteria, of course, to decide which ones are successful. And then the last one is the policy around free, prior, informed consent that I talked about. And so really, this is going to take more discussion, more engagement with advisors and leaders to look at if there is an application for a project and there's uncertainty around whether it's supported by the appropriate nation, an organization, that there's some type of guidance for grant staff, because that's not up to grant staff to decide this is the right nation, not that one. So they really need something that has been endorsed and supported by Indigenous folks themselves. So under governance, so the Board of Governors, there are, as you saw, are appointing bodies to the Board of Governors. And currently there's no Indigenous or First Nations entity that can appoint to the Board of Governors. And so there's an extension of an invitation to potentially the First Nations Leadership Council, or, you know, really we're seeking advice on this as to who would be an appropriate Indigenous organization to appoint to the board. Beyond the board as decision makers, we also have an opportunity and an action to include more Indigenous advisors, contractors, and other collaborators, as they have been doing and will continue, but to really be more inclusive, I would say, as a governance, and not as hierarchical with a board as the key decision makers. Recognition and respect for the City of Vancouver UNDRIP strategy. So this is really, again, honoring where their office is located, recognizing and respecting those territories, and supporting the City of Vancouver UNDRIP strategy, and encouraging other funders who might also reside in the City of Vancouver to do so as well. And then, you know, looking long term, this was established, the governance structure currently was established in the 1980s. And so maybe there's something that is more reflective of reconciliation, more reflective of an Indigenous-led entity. So really going through a longer term process with Indigenous leadership to look at the governance and decision-making for the foundation. So under organization operations, so this is everything from communications to investment strategies, human resources, procurement. So this is all sort of the nuts and bolts day-to-day operations of the foundation. And so one of the actions we have here is to ensure that cultural safety and anti-racism training is provided for both Board of Governors and staff. And so that's where you want to include Indigenous people as staff or board, that they're coming into a culturally safe space. And similarly, when you're interacting with Indigenous grantees. So there's a number of offerings for that type of training. The foundation also engages quite a bit in site visits, and so really like to going out to the communities, the lands where they are funding, to see the work and to build those relationships. So it's a real opportunity to ensure respectful permission protocols, and that there's a welcome open door when they do those site visits. And where there is no existing relationship with First Nations in the area, that's an opportunity to build that based on respect. Mark mentioned also that the funds that are generated from the real estate transactions are then invested, and then there's additional resources that are accrued through that investment. And so there's a typical, you know, environmental, social, governance, ESG criteria or screening for investment, but we really need to enhance that and make it more centered around Indigenous rights, because what we might see is we could be supporting a lot of great work with these funds, but the investment actually might be not in alignment with UNDRIP. So we may see investment and banking operations that could actually undermine Indigenous rights. And so there's two actions there around doing that screening and ensuring that due diligence. And then lastly, under communications, the Real Estate Foundation hosts the Land Awards every 2 years, which is an incredible gala, basically sharing excellence in land and water stewardship. And this is another opportunity through the nominees, the judging committees, keynote speakers, performance, and procurement opportunities to really highlight and promote Indigenous excellence and leadership. And the last one was definitely that, and hopefully the one this year, if you're interested in joining, will also be, and I think that's in June in Vancouver. So as we go through the engagement and outreach, as I mentioned, per UNDRIP, we need to ensure that if we're talking about people's rights, that they are included in the decision-making. So we've prioritized those First Nations in BC who have land rights and title. And we've provided multiple options for engagement, extra time, resources to engage. And where there are changes, which we have a few that I'll touch upon, that we are going to update the TAUA, and we will then bring it back to the Board of Governors for final endorsement in June. So once that is approved, what I'm recommending, and again, this is all sort of up for discussion as we go through this process, is that it kind of stays in place for around 3 years before amendments are considered. And so we all like the notion of a living document, and but we do need some firm commitments. We need something to measure progress on, and then make amendments based on our learnings. And so we would then also again recommend First Nations review as a part of that amendment process, potentially within 3 years. So to be transparent, to be accountable for these 50 actions, there will be an annual UNDRIP report produced each November, and it will be shared out. If you're not already on the REFBC listserv, please feel free to sign up for that, and you can see the UNDRIP report and track the progress. And that will also help inform any future amendments. So one of the staff, the senior staff, really asked in one of our sessions, how do we know if we've succeeded in this work? How do we know that we've arrived, that we have done what we have said we were going to do? And so she kind of challenged us to think about a future story and vision. And so this is one that's just sort of put out there for discussion. And so far, we haven't heard too much detraction from it, which is good, but open for discussion, of course. And so we're really moving from a place of a bit more of an ad hoc approach, a bit more of learning and not quite being informed, and some challenges, definitely some challenges. And so what we want to move towards is really an informed position on Indigenous rights that's based on active learning and listening and openness, and that there are reciprocal relationships between the foundation and Indigenous peoples that is informed by cultural safety and decolonizing practices, as well as transformative commitments. And that we can say with some degree of certainty that funds that are generated from the sale of unceded lands are being distributed back to First Nations, and that are supporting self-determined land-based work, and that Indigenous peoples are involved in the day-to-day operation and strategic decision-making at REFBC, and that we have meaningful qualitative and quantitative data to be transparent regarding these commitments, and that we're really building on continual improvement, and there's accountability, though, on that total percentage of grants and funds supporting Indigenous-led projects. And overall, there's a coordinated, holistic, and whole of organization approach to advance UNDRIP. So because we were talking largely about grant making, I just wanted to share some examples, and there's many available on the website as well, the Real Estate Foundation website. And you can see different stories and photos and things like that. So these are some of the recently funded projects through the Indigenous grant stream. And so if you remember, that was the pilot that became a permanent program recently. So supporting the Chilcotin Dasiko Tribal Park, the gatherings and youth mentoring, the Denikaye Institute, supporting their National Casca Elders Council, the Indigenous Physical Activity and Cultural Circle, supporting their physical training for canoe warriors, the Kanakabar Food Self-Sufficiency Initiative, Yakanuki or Tobacco Plains, the Horseshoe Lake, North Wetland Restoration, the Tsimshian Culture Society, the Hakalaksa Project, Coastal Foodways, support for the Central Coast Food Champions, and Soto First Nations work on their Indigenous knowledge and caribou habitat. Just a couple photos from the stories on the website, the Dasyko Tribal Park, the Skeena River Fish Camp, just near where I live, supporting youth knowledge transfer on fishing, food preservation, and Indigenous knowledge. And overall, there was 16, in the last round, 16 Indigenous-led projects supported through that work. So in terms of some of the non-Indigenous led or partnership projects that have recently been funded, these are just examples, of course. Social Planning Cowichan. So this is a partnership between a non-Indigenous organization, some local government involvement, and looking to establish Indigenous-led land trusts to engage private landholders. West Coast Environmental Law, revitalizing Indigenous law for land, air, and water. And so these folks provide pro bono free legal services to Indigenous people, Indigenous nations across BC to help focus research and applying and enforcing Indigenous laws. And lastly, the Sierra Club Foundation of BC. That project around Indigenous-led forest conservation supports Indigenous land use visions and objectives for forest conservation, building an online toolkit, technical support, and strategic analysis. So these are examples of really true partnerships, and applying UNDRIP criteria can help to advance mutual benefit between NGOs and local governments and First Nations. So as we are wrapping up the engagement towards the end of this month, some of the things we've heard so far, we've heard some great feedback, and we've heard some concrete things that people want to see included. And so some great recognition from the Tecumseh Nation, acknowledging the important work, framing UNDRIP, and seeking out feedback as critical. Kanakabar really being affected by an ongoing cycle of climate crises, wildfire, flooding, evacuations, and they really need support that is nimble and flexible and really prioritizes climate resilience. And then the Office of the Wet'suwet'en, they're challenged with a very small human resource pool and needing to attract good candidates and good employees. And so they really need to prioritize multi-year funding to give that certainty to their employees. So that's the conclusion. We do have time, about 10 minutes for any questions, any thoughts in the Q&A. I think Stephen might be able to help moderate. But I'd like to say Doik Sitnism, I thank you all for your time, for your attention. And if we have not so many questions, we can also turn it back over to Mark for closing remarks. Okay, so we've got a raised hand, but I think we've got a Q&A function. Now I'll just read one. In the action examples grant slide, you reference more applications than money. Is that the current status? I'm gonna let Mark answer that because he'll have a little, I have a general understanding, but I think Mark would be better to answer that.
Yeah, I think it's a reference to kind of current state view, where there's certainly more demand for resources that we have available, but and we're seeing that through our general grant cycle. And this year, particularly, we've just concluded a stage 1 intake, and we're seeing requests probably in the line of 70% higher than what we actually than our grants budget, which makes for tough decisions, and it reflects like the challenges and the ambitions that we see in community. So
Thanks, Mark.
is there other questions there? I thought
Yeah, I see RJ, I'm not sure if you're able to put yours in the Q&A. Thanks. Any plans for in-person or Zoom sharing of innovative initiatives for peer learning regionally or provincially? Yeah, great question. I think you might be referring to maybe between projects, perhaps. Um, but definitely the TAUA itself will be shared out through various forums and has been sort of in its concept development. And so a number of opportunities to share with other funders. And then on the peer learning, I wonder if I think there's some sharing between the projects in the Indigenous grant stream that's happening. Mark, is there any thoughts on that question there?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few sort of pieces underway, but we're also looking at other ways um, to share learning, so that we've often done, I shouldn't say often, but pull together kind of impact reports on occasion that try to synthesize some of the learning that we've done. We will be hosting I think the plan is, particularly for the Indigenous granting stream, to host conversations in community or online from a regional standpoint. And then there's work that we do with peers as well as other funders. So we're looking forward to trying to make the learning we're doing as a whole of organization visible to other funders that are expressing interest and a desire to either show up a little differently or figure out what their path is, given their connections to land and people and the wealth that's generated, and the wealth that actually underpins so much of philanthropy, and how folks can create alignment between sort of what their money story is and their connection to producing wealth off the land, and how that actually can create opportunities for redress, for relationship building, for reconciliation that's got some meat to it, right? It's moving beyond, not that it's not important, but beyond the symbolic recognition through a land acknowledgement, or through other kinds of relatively easy participation that are important and feel good and educational opportunities, but need to be followed through with actual action. And yeah, so, and that's part of our opportunity. And I think, as you know, as Tara's shared the story, and as I learn and think more each time I sort of reflect on the work we're trying to do, or step back and reflect on where we're going, but the reminder that, you know, being in this work, as I'm sure it is for those of you who are also in it, you know, it helps us do more in better relationship and create better impact through our mission and resources, and that will, you know, that helps us be relevant and actually valuable with both peers and with community.
There's just a couple that have popped up, so thank you. There's one around Indigenous led, which I know that Stephen provided a written answer for, but I just wanted to highlight it for others because it was a term that was used quite a bit in the presentation. So there is a sort of a framework that has been developed by the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal People. That's a great place to start to understand Indigenous-led projects and what that means. There's other categories like Indigenous benefiting, Indigenous involved. So I'm pretty sure Stephen's provided that answer. So thank you. And then another one we have from Kim, amazing work. Appreciate you sharing for the broader community. Curious to hear more about how you're realizing UNDRIP in your investments. And I can certainly start, and then Mark can probably fill in a little more. But I know we've started that work now in looking at both the banking managers as well as the investment criteria. And so it is early days, but there's definitely a recognition that this needs to be applied in that. And so, Mark, I don't know if you want to provide any more update on
Yeah,
that.
I think that's probably, I mean, so we're in a review, we're in a review process, and getting some support on that. There is, and this is, as many of you might imagine, relatively new terrain for many financial institutions, who are beginning to do more and more substantive work, or you see a bigger spectrum of work in an ESG space, from everything that is kind of greenwashing to work in an ESG space with depth. And so those are helpful directions, but a little newer and is the body of work and thinking in terms of how do you embed UNDRIP commitments or commitments to advancing Indigenous rights and title and free, prior, and informed consent in the context of an investment strategy. And there's, in a diversified investment strategy, there are some areas that are easier to do that than others, just given the complexity of the investment terrain. But we're trying to figure it out, and like that's and ensure that we're continuing to deepen our commitments through all phases of our organization, including our investment strategy and our financial relationships. So
next one is from Zafar. Very impressive trajectory. Thank you for sharing. Are you considering leveraging of other resources, financial or otherwise, that take place in projects supported by BC? Yeah, I guess this one, I mean, there are always sort of other funders that are supporting projects that REFBC might be supporting. Certainly sharing this out is always welcome. And then, you know, that REFBC, you know, started this journey with the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, which wasn't a part of the core funding. And was actually, you know, the province looking to have someone administer funds on their behalf. And so there's always those opportunities. There's also the Watershed Security Fund, which is currently being sort of hosted in the interim by the Real Estate Foundation. And so there's absolutely, I would say, those ongoing opportunities, both at the project level and then sort of the meta funding level. And then Graham asked about tension or balance between focusing, this is a great one, thank you for asking it, focusing on the funding of territories where most real estate transactions take place, which we know is Vancouver, Lower Mainland, Victoria, parts of the Okanagan, versus supporting work across the province. It's a consideration in the report and deeply transformative. Thank you so much for catching that. And it is something that we've got data now on that really show that you know, the bulk of the revenues are coming from a certain concentrated area, which we all know. And so we have made special effort to reach out to those nations to try and engage on this, to sort of get their input, because we don't want to make sort of actions that that don't reflect that. Certainly it's not that there is no revenue coming from other parts, it's just that there's a lot less. And so how that factors into those targets that I talked about, definitely a part of the deeply transformative work in getting better data and then engaging those people to ensure that we are setting targets that respect their rights and title and the impacts of fee simple on their lands. The last one, for those starting out, what do you suggest we can all do in addition to land acknowledgement by elders at events, etc.? Thank you, Denise. Mark, you want to take a crack at that one, how you started this?
Well, I don't know, if you have a chance to go through the report, I mean, there's different ways to do that, and it's kind of dependent on organizational context and what you do. But that learning work and relationship building work that's important starting work. Like, just where are you and who's whose lands are you connected to, and who's, you know, or what might you discover in just an exploration of that, and then, and that will produce kind of that will surface wisdom and understanding that can inform some organizations. But I think trying to, yeah, if looking at, like, we're finding it helpful to look at, to use UNDRIP as a reference point, partly because there's been so much development in it, and so it's a good reference point for us and gives some direction on, oh, these are pieces that there's strong alignment with our mission and our mandate, and we can find an easier way to draw a line of sight to actioning issues on that. So it may seem like a lot when you first look at it, but as Tara pointed out, they're actually, the articles are actually straightforward and point in good directions for organizations or people to draw from, in terms of, oh, this is how I can make that meaningful in my work. And it's not none of this happens. Oh, well, I shouldn't say none of it, but it's long work, right? It's not just to tick the box and next. It's even when you feel like, okay, we've done this, like we've made such great gains here, but those need to be sustained and carried forward too. So
Great, thank you. Well, that's the end of our questions, and Stephen has been great adding all the links and information in the chat. Please fill out the survey, give us your feedback, and thank you so much for attending Doik Sitnism. I wish you a great rest of your day and continued work in upholding UNDRIP. Thank you.
thank you, Tara. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate. And there will be a link going out.
Yeah, for the survey.
Tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.